Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. As said, my name is Caitlin. I'm the Director of Corporate Marketing at Allocadia. I'm going to give you a quick overview of Allocadia first, just so the journey I talk about makes a bit more sense, and then we'll dive into really what my team's been doing. Allocadia is another MarTech software. Our platform gives marketers the ability to plan strategically, invest with purpose, and maximize the ability for marketing to have true business impact. So at the end of the day, what our mission is we want to give marketers the confidence to be able to know exactly where they should be investing their next dollar. As I was thinking about this presentation, I really felt like this was such a good place to start, because this is the way we talk about the value we bring to our customers. And I think for every marketer, especially since March and the pandemic has hit, like there's really just been this huge urgency around like, how are we supporting our current customer base? How do we get visibility into what they need? How do we make sure the messages we're putting out are resonating with them and actually bringing them value? It's not just us tooting our own horn. And from corporate marketing, it's an interesting perspective because we do everything that's comms and communications and content. And really what it boiled down to is that in most days, I have three core focus areas. One is supporting customer with value. The other is around brand awareness. And the third is around how do we support demand gen and sales programs with content. And I realized like the messaging piece became so critical over the last couple months. And so for me, it's been exciting because I'm a former journalist. And so that like storytelling angle and how do you make sure you're hitting people with like exactly what's going to resonate with them is something I'm truly passionate about. On the flip side, like many marketers, I'm incredibly type A. So when I started digging into our content journey and realized I could not quantify what was happening and what was working, it drove me nuts. So that's really the journey I'm going to tell you today, is how I took that blend and that love of the art side and the storytelling side and realized that at Allocadia, we needed a much stronger science side to marry that with so that we could get to this better level of engagement and create this journey. So I started at Allocadia over 2 years ago now. And when I started, I really started digging into our content and realized we were producing a ton of amazing content. Like we have a very strong content engine, have for years, even before I joined the team. But what we had was literally no visibility into which content was having impact. Like many more old school ways of assessing content, we had downloads. When we produced a really big ebook, we would see like how many people downloaded it based on email, maybe a couple through social, but there was no other strong metric. And not only does that not give you a full view, but it also leads to, in all honesty, like it leads to people creating myth content, because you just have these random acts of content when you don't have like a rigorous perspective of, is it working? Why did we produce it? People just create what they think is interesting. And sometimes that can work really well, but not all the time. And so I wanted us to move further and further away from that. These are all people on our team at Allocadia, and these are the kinds of questions that we were all asking ourselves. And our content strategy was maturing. I was trying to nail some things down. And ultimately what it was just showing us was all these cracks where like we had so many questions about how it was performing, but no clear data to show us where we should go next. And part of that is just because at that point, content, like performance data was really limited for us. So website traffic is always a good indicator of like, are we getting like, it takes into account SEO, it takes into account how well it's being spread on various social channels. Are you creating a bit of an echo chamber with the right audiences where they're sharing your content too? So that's a great one, but like it still doesn't support the idea of, are they reading this content at the right time? Is it driving them further down the buyer's funnel or buyer's journey? Same with form fills. Like it's great for a massive ebook, or when you're doing a webinar like this, you have a form fill, you collect information. When you're downloading a high value asset, like without something to show you how long they're reading it, all you can see is that someone downloaded it. You don't know if they actually read it. If they looked at the cover page, we're like, nope, not for me. Or if they passed it to 14 people internally and you've created this massive like buying center in an enterprise account for yourself. You have no clue what's happening. And the other piece that was there was pure gut feelings on my point. Like I said, I'm a former journalist. I'm particularly judgy about the content we put out and the storylines we're doing. And so me musing about it and like having some guesses about it was fine for a while. But like ultimately, my wine-laced musings are not something I'm going to like lock down a content strategy on. I did not have enough confidence to do that. So ultimately, all of these pieces were coming together within the first like 4 to 6 months that I was working at Allocadia. And I just realized we desperately needed to unlock this next level for ourselves. So for me, it was these three key pieces. Understanding is really knowing, like, what are people digesting? What are they reading? How long are they reading it? That starts to get you to a bit more of the why. You can start to piece some of that together with that information. From there, I wanted to be able to serve them that content at the exact right time. So accelerate how they were using content to move them further down that buying cycle. And then ultimately optimize, like looking at how are we going to scale this? I didn't want us to be like a constant struggle of how do we assess content. I wanted to put better processes in place so that we could say, yes, this is how we structure content, this is how we review it regularly, and then this is how we ultimately report on, like, is it working, is it not, and what's next. So from there, so I've talked a lot about like my judginess on like the art of the content creation. I needed better science is really what it boiled down to. Like, I have amazing content writers internally. We got people with great ideas, but we didn't have the science piece locked down. And so we needed that canvas for the art to be created upon. So this is the structure that we have for our content itself. Our entire MarTech stack is much larger than this, but for the content piece itself, we have our CMS. Obviously, the website is, it's our home. This is like where everything lives. A year ago, we actually ripped it down to the studs and rebuilt it to be more just more modern, to be honest. But at the same time, WordPress as a CMS still has limitations in how well you can track your buyer's journey. So for us, using PathFactory then to layer on top of it started to give us that insight. So even on a page where we're like, okay, it's a high traffic page, you don't know what they're digesting. PathFactory is the way I'm now able to use that. So like weaving that throughout our website, weaving that throughout our ad landing pages, and being able to really start to track, like, okay, I don't have a team size that's big enough to require a much more advanced CMS to help me see that buyer's journey. PathFactory is how I'm doing it at my smaller marketing team. And then for us, Terminus is the other part of it where we're getting these smarter content offers. So we do targeted ads. We're using content assets based on stage of the funnel, use cases, and then the PathFactory tracks are layered into that as well. And so these are the three core like technologies we're using in order to start creating this better buyer's journey for our content, and working with our demand gen team too, because obviously a lot of this content's going out through their channels. So with us getting our house in order, we've been able to get a much better view of holistically, here's how this content performs, and then they can dive into their channels that they own and say like, okay, this is working really well in email, not as well in ads. Maybe it's the stage of the funnel, but it's getting us to those better conversations around like what's working and why. From here now, I'm going to break down the phases of this project. Like kind of what I went through is the ultimate. We had this vision of where we wanted to get to. It's obviously not something you implement overnight. So for us, this phase one, we've now been PathFactory customers, I believe, for about 18 months. The first 6 months was literally a lot of work, just getting all of our content in the system, and then actually just getting my team to use it over and over again, because we needed to start collecting data on how was the content being engaged with. Like getting all the content in the system was just step one. It was then getting the demand gen team to say, okay, for every email that we send, every ad that goes out, it needs to have a PathFactory link within it and get to that track, because that's how we're seeing buyer's journey and buyer's experience right now. It was the same with the SDR team. So for us, it's we've been ramping further and further into the sales team. I'll talk about that a little at the end as a later phase, but the SDRs were a critical part of phase one for me, because our SDR team, we sell direct, we sell to other marketing organizations. And so they have a very organized like cadence of outreach that we were able to put tracks into, so that we could then see, in addition to just like what parts of marketing we're working well with content, we could see, oh, if it's coming from an SDR, is there a difference in the type of content they're doing? So for us, it was like a really strong piece around like, how do we just get that data in so that we can start getting smarter? And so you can see this is just, for example, one of our tracks. Like we've been doing some homepage work with it. We started pushing it into our website, was the next phase after just getting like the rest of the demand gen team and the SDR team using it. So last September, we went through a massive brand refresh, which is when I ripped my website apart. And with the new website, what we started doing was layering PathFactory tracks onto high traffic pages. So I worked with our head of digital, who was really involved in the SEO side of our website rebuild. And so we identified some core pages where we're like, we know more and more people are coming to these pages. Let's input PathFactory tracks throughout so we can gauge where they're engaging, how deeply they're engaging, like can we keep them on our pages and decrease our bounce rates. all of that kind of stuff. And so that was really for us, like how we started supporting that buyer's journey and using PathFactory as a layer on top of WordPress so that we could get deeper insights, even with a tool that does not support that true buyer's journey like WordPress. Okay, so what did we learn after phase one? What we did learn is that it's funny because like in so much of communications, there's always this talk about like there is no silver bullet. You can't just like find the one ultimate like communications or marketing strategy that's going to solve all of your problems. So the idea of calling something magic, like fundamentally I had a little bit of a problem with, but it was true. We actually found that there was some of this like magic content, we called it, where it was top performing assets that even if they were like 3 and 4 years old, continue to perform at such a better rate than some of the new content we put out. So what we realized is that we were like, okay, we need to make sure that for each stage of the journey and for each use case, we have this right, like big kind of like magic content that's going to start forcing people to dive deeper into other content. And that was the idea, is that like new wasn't better. Like surprisingly, some of our top performers were pretty old. And so what we started doing was just realizing like, oh, we actually just need to like update the visuals, maybe tweak the messaging a little bit, but we didn't need to go like recreate the wheel. We just needed to refresh it so it fit the current brand a bit better. And the other thing that we realized was that for the SDRs, we started implementing fast moving buyer alerts. So people that were binging on content through PathFactory, we alerted these to the SDR team. And I do want to shout out here to our head of SDRs and our head of digital. We couldn't have done this without them. Like they went in and figured out, how do we make sure that these tracks have the right content? How do we make sure that the SDRs get insights into like what content was actually binged on? But what the SDR team figured out was like the folks that had been binging were taking calls at like 2 and 3x the rates than cold calls. Or even those that had just binged on one piece of, like they downloaded one ebook before. We found that these people, like they were so much more willing to have the conversation. So we started accelerating the number of people that the SDRs were talking with. So our head of SDRs is our biggest advocate on the sales side for PathFactory. Like he will promote it to everyone. He calls out the AEs who don't use it and tells them they're stupid because they could be getting more insights. Like he just loves it because he immediately started seeing the value of like, these people are a much better warmed up prospect because they've been able to do this and binge on this content. So that was a really key learning for us, that like, this is valuable, not just for the marketing, for the content side, for what I wanted to see, but this is driving value further into our organization as well. We decided at this point to hone in on that top performing use case, and we started structuring the tracks that we were putting together really, really strongly around the phases of our demand gen funnel. So we had the 3 use cases of like awareness, consideration, decision, and then we bucketed it by use cases as well. And our goal was that we were going to make things easier on the demand gen and ultimately on the sales team too, is that they would know immediately which assets to use based on phase of the funnel or type of program and use case. And so it was really this idea that like by constantly assessing this content, we were making sure that we were optimizing the content that needed to be used and that they weren't having to go pull new assets every time they had an idea. And this is part of that, like this a little bit going into that top performing piece too, is this is how we were accelerating it. And this hard, very intense work goes shout out to our content marketer internally. Her name's Shannon. She's a very gifted writer, but also pretty analytical. And so what she did based on that metric I just talked about a little before in terms of looking within PathFactory to say, okay, what content is getting the most engagement? What content is getting the longest viewing times? That's that ultimate top performing metric. We then mapped it against the Serious Decisions buyer journey. So we looked at for each of these stages, what types of content should be included. And then we used that to say, okay, do we have high performing content of that type? And we had like 3/4 of it, I would say, 2/3, 3/4. We had a pretty good mix. But it actually helped us understand too, those gaps where we're like, wow, we don't have enough of this content. What should we be doing? Where should we be filling these gaps in? So it made us instantly going through this process of mapping this out. We were not only supporting the acceleration of demand gen programs, SDR programs, we also got smarter on the corporate side with all of our content creation where we could say, yeah, we don't need another ebook. What we need is more short form content is what we found out. And so that's where we got to this one, is like we made it to that optimized phase. And what we were finding is that when people had shorter form content first, they were more likely to dive into that bigger form content. When we just like started out with an ebook, we just had like, in some instances, if it was something like a Forrester Wave, they would dive into it. They'd spend more time on it. With some of the others, we were just seeing they dropped off really fast. I don't think any marketer, any content marketer ever wants to be like, yes, we're going to double down on infographics. They're a pain in the ass to create. They take so much time. But what we realized is like, we needed that more short form, like snackable content, I guess you could call it. And because we needed to get people further down that funnel and get them to start binging, so we needed to start them off small. So this is just one of those like little weird things we learned. We were like, wow, we really need to double down on this. And so for every long form content piece we put out, we have this shorter form infographic. But what was cool is that we could actually go back and to one of my previous slides where it was new is not better. We were able to take some of that really good performing old content that was just maybe a bit too like word heavy and create these shorter forms out of it. So it made us be a bit more flexible in how we looked at content creation, that it didn't have to be creating the wheel every time, that it was about just taking what was there and taking this really smart content that was just too long and creating it in short form as well. So it gave us that really good insight in terms of how do we structure the next 3-4 months of content creation. You're like, we've got most of the ebooks we need. What we need is these shorter form, more digestible. I can read it on the fly as I'm like in between meetings or waiting in the grocery store line, things like that. So those were the 3 phases that we've gone through at this point. And so no like case study presentation is complete without a results slide. So what we did start seeing, the 17% is very tightly tied in with what I was talking about with our SDRs, is we saw more and more engagement with people that were doing binging type of activities, like the people that were reading multiple pieces of content at what time. There were 17% more engaged than those that just had the one and done content offers, or those that we were just cold calling. Like we saw this huge boost in terms of the productivity of our SDR team because they were targeting folks that they knew were warmer leads based on this. So that was really, really fantastic. And that then led into even a bigger business metric that we saw this improvement in the closed won rate for those ops that were influenced by PathFactory content tracks. So for me, this is the ultimate, like I mentioned in the beginning, being fairly type A, I really struggled early on with the fact that I could not quantify content marketing in the same way that like a demand gen program could. I wanted to be able to tie it more tightly to those broader business metrics because I think we've all heard about sales marketing alignment until like we could go cross-eyed, but it's true. Like if your sales team doesn't understand the business impact you're making, if your finance team can't understand the business impact of what your content marketing is going to be doing, you're either going to lose budget or you're going to lose respect, and both of those suck. So it really for us was being able to start tying this more tightly into the fact that like when you get the right content in front of people, you're getting them warmed up, they're having better conversations with sales, and they're seeing that value earlier, which is accelerating and improving that sales velocity. So that's the big picture, but I did want to touch on some of the other ideas that are maybe not as quantifiable right in this moment, but I still think, especially in the world today, are incredibly valuable. So for me, this is the idea of agility. And right now, I think every marketer in the world is being tasked with the fact that we still have these like annual business goals, but how we get there based on the state of the world tends to change, honestly, month to month at this point. Like what messaging is working? What does your budget look like? Like, how is the business operating? Did something else in the world blow up where you have to fundamentally change what you're doing to target people? All of those questions are being constantly asked of marketing organizations as we put out programs, as we put out messaging. And so for me, PathFactory has been huge in helping me assess that. So we do these biweekly reviews at this point of our content and look at what types of content, what themes in particular are working. I fundamentally believe that like type of content, everyone has different preferences. So I rely less personally on type of content. Like some people like shorter stuff. There are the people that only want to read like an in-depth ebook. So I think having a broader mix there is important, but for me, the themes are really critical. And so for us, back in March, we started tracking COVID-19. You can see on the screen as a sub-theme for us. So if the content was about investment or planning for marketers, that was still tagged because that was the ultimate like storyline or use case theme for us, but we started tracking COVID-19 as a secondary theme for all of the content we were putting out that was very short form, that was like, we know your budgets have no visibility, they're getting taken away today because the world blew up, and here's how to address it. So we had a lot of content focused on how-tos, quick learning. And over the past month and a half, we've seen this shift where there's engagement there, but it's not quite the same. And so we've had, like many websites, we've had a header on our website for the past 3 months, 4 months, I think at this point, just directing people to that. When they hit our website, we're like, are you looking for this specifically because of the pandemic? Here's some content to help you get started. And as we realized, this is all happening right now too. Like, we're in the midst of changing this header because our content team was able to look at PathFactory data, say, this COVID content isn't performing the same way. Where we're seeing a tick is some of the content that we hadn't even tagged yet, but that was more focused on, like, the pandemic has happened, you probably have like a new state of normal, how are you recovering? And so we're actually now pivoting where we're going to start using recovery as another sub theme to start tracking how that content does. And we're changing the header based on this. And this is all happening today, actually. It's going to be going into production, but we're going to have a new header where we can start tracking that content. And that agility to be able to respond to shifts in the world, especially for like more topical content like blogs and things like that, is so critical in today's marketing world, I think. And having the data backed insights to do this, not doing this on like gut instinct or because some executive was like, well, I think it should be this today, is just, it's a really powerful way for us to address how we're supporting like the entire revenue process at Allocadia, but also gives my team the confidence to say, like, we're doing this based on data. We know why we're doing this, and we understand the impact we're making. So it goes just towards that confidence and like understanding the value we bring, which is a really good thing. And especially where the world's in a weird place. I think all of us have had professional and personal ups and downs the last couple of months. And so having that stability in knowing what's working in your day-to-day life and on the professional side, I think is really, really important, just from like keeping people's state of mind happier. There's always some content that you know is your bread and butter, and you know you're going to put it out and it's going to be great and you don't even sweat it. There is always that second tier of content where you're like, this is a little outside our comfort zone, whether it's a pandemic or whether there's like an internal crisis. And yeah, having the data to back that up and be able to move forward in a time of great flux was such a relief for our team to just be like, nope, if anyone has questions, we have data to back up why we made this decision. And we were able to see, like, we saw a 2x increase in engagement on that content we were putting out that was like very how to get through this pandemic. And so that did perform really, really well for us. Awesome. So I wanted to leave with a little bit of like, what does our future look like? So for me, it's this idea of this always on nurture, and PathFactory being a huge piece of this is just that we want to optimize the experience. I know there's always within the marketing world, like we're always trying to drill down into like, how do we get more personalized even with broader marketing? It's always easy to say like sales is a one-to-one conversation, marketing is a 1-to-100 conversation. And that will probably always in some element be true. But the more we can optimize the experience based on what we know of what they're already interested in, the better marketers we're all going to be. So for me, it's really, this is one example of just like how we're going to do it on website pages, but we're really thinking about how do we do this with demand gen program follow-ups, our advertising, even our sales cadences, is really like, how do we nurture buyers towards that magic asset? Like those big assets that we know are the most crucial. How do we start with the right, easy to consume content and just keep pushing them further and further down the funnel? And for these high traffic website pages, it may be different content versus if you land on a blog page somewhere and we just know you're really interested in this in-depth concept of zero-based budgeting, which is something that's coming up for us. Like, we want to make sure that we're being really, really conscious of like, what would you want to read next, and making sure that we have all of these abilities for people wherever they land and wherever they are in their buying process to get to that next right content to help them further educate themselves. And for us, like, that's really the ultimate goal, is that the more we can do that, the better help my content team is to the demand gen team and the sales organization. So that's what I had for you guys today. Thank you for the time.